Welcome back. Today's story takes us deep into the shadows of 1856 Natchez, where a single enslaved child did something unthinkable and exposed the darkest secrets of the most powerful elite. This is not a legend, not folklore, but a hidden scandal buried under wealth, silence, and fear. Before we begin, comment below and tell me where you're watching from, and if you value stories built on real historical digging and verified facts. Take a moment to subscribe. A tremendous amount of work goes into uncovering truths that history tried to erase, and your support keeps these stories alive. Imagine a society ruled by aristocrats, plantations, and absolute control, where no enslaved voice was supposed to matter. Yet in 1856, one child became the crack in a flawless facade. What began as a whisper inside plantation quarters soon spiraled into a scandal that shook Natchez's most powerful families. Courts trembled, reputations collapsed, and secrets that were never meant to surface clawed their way into the light. This story is not just about cruelty, but about fear, power, and the unbearable weight of truth, when even a child refuses to stay silent. As we move through this story, remember this: history often survives because someone, somewhere, broke the rules of silence. And in this case, it was a child the elite believed no one would ever listen to. By the mid-19th century, Natchez, Mississippi was one of the richest slaveholding regions in the United States. Its wealth came from vast cotton plantations that lined the Mississippi River, owned by a small, tightly connected group of white elites. These families controlled thousands of acres of land and enslaved laborers, generating enormous profits that placed Natchez among the top slave markets in the Deep South. Cotton money built lavish mansions, funded private education, and sustained a social order designed to protect elite dominance at all costs. This aristocracy was not just wealthy, it was politically entrenched. Plantation owners often served as judges, legislators, sheriffs, and bank directors. Local courts rarely ruled against them, and when disputes arose, outcomes were shaped behind closed doors long before trials began. Newspapers depended on their patronage, churches relied on their donations, and law enforcement answered to their influence. In Natchez, power was inherited, reinforced through marriage, and guarded through loyalty among elite families. Social life in Natchez revolved around exclusivity and image. Grand balls, riverfront estates, and social clubs reinforced class divisions and projected an illusion of refinement and moral superiority. Publicly, these families presented themselves as benevolent masters and defenders of Southern values. Privately, their authority relied on violence, intimidation, and silence. Any threat to reputation was treated as an existential danger, especially when it involved enslaved people who were legally denied credibility. Enslaved individuals lived under constant surveillance within this system. Laws prohibited them from testifying against white people, owning property, or traveling freely. Punishment for resistance could include whipping, sale, or death. The aristocracy depended on fear to maintain order, ensuring that abuse, exploitation, and crimes committed within plantations never reached public scrutiny. Silence was enforced not just by law, but by terror. This is why the events of 1856 were so destabilizing. When an enslaved child's story began to circulate, it threatened more than a single household. It challenged the credibility, unity, and perceived invincibility of Natchez's ruling class. For an elite built on the belief that power could erase truth, the mere possibility of exposure was enough to cause panic, retaliation, and desperate attempts to regain control. By the mid-19th century, Natchez, Mississippi was one of the richest slaveholding regions in the United States. Its wealth came from vast cotton plantations that lined the Mississippi River, owned by a small, tightly connected group of white elites. These families controlled thousands of acres of land and enslaved laborers, generating enormous profits that placed Natchez among the top slave markets in the Deep South. Cotton money built lavish mansions, funded private education, and sustained a social order designed to protect elite dominance at all costs. This aristocracy was not just wealthy, it was politically entrenched. Plantation owners often served as judges, legislators, sheriffs, and bank directors. Local courts rarely ruled against them, and when disputes arose, outcomes were shaped behind closed doors long before trials began. Newspapers depended on their patronage, churches relied on their donations, and law enforcement answered to their influence. In Natchez, power was inherited, reinforced through marriage, and guarded through loyalty among elite families. Social life in Natchez revolved around exclusivity and image. Grand balls, riverfront estates, and social clubs reinforced class divisions and projected an illusion of refinement and moral superiority. Publicly, these families presented themselves as benevolent masters and defenders of Southern values. Privately, their authority relied on violence, intimidation, and silence. Any threat to reputation was treated as an existential danger, especially when it involved enslaved people who were legally denied credibility. Enslaved individuals lived under constant surveillance within this system. Laws prohibited them from testifying against white people, owning property, or traveling freely. Punishment for resistance could include whipping, sale, or death. The aristocracy depended on fear to maintain order, ensuring that abuse, exploitation, and crimes committed within plantations never reached public scrutiny. Silence was enforced not just by law, but by terror. This is why the events of 1856 were so destabilizing. When an enslaved child's story began to circulate, it threatened more than a single household. It challenged the credibility, unity, and perceived invincibility of Natchez's ruling class. For an elite built on the belief that power could erase truth, the mere possibility of exposure was enough to cause panic, retaliation, and desperate attempts to regain control. In antebellum Natchez, enslaved children were rarely documented as individuals. Plantation records often listed them only by first name, age range, or monetary value, if they were listed at all. Births went unregistered, family ties were ignored, and ownership mattered more than identity. This deliberate lack of documentation made enslaved children legally invisible, a condition that protected slaveholders while erasing any trace of the child's personal history. In court or public records, such a child could be dismissed as nameless, unreliable, or non-existent. This erasure served a strategic purpose. Under Mississippi law at the time, enslaved people could not testify against white citizens, and children were considered especially untrustworthy. By keeping the child's identity vague, plantation owners ensured that any accusation or revelation could be easily discredited. If the child spoke, elites could claim confusion, mistaken identity, or fabrication. The absence of clear records was not accidental neglect, but a safeguard designed to shield the powerful from accountability. Within the enslaved community, however, identity carried a different meaning. The child was known by name, lineage, and story among fellow enslaved people. Oral memory preserved what official documents erased. Elders knew who the child belonged to, where they had been sent, and what they had witnessed. These details were shared quietly, often in whispers, because acknowledging the child's true identity meant acknowledging danger. Knowledge itself became a risk. Plantation households also relied on strategic transfers to obscure responsibility. Enslaved children were frequently moved between estates, loaned to relatives, or sold across county lines. Such movement fractured memory and made tracking individuals nearly impossible. If a problem arose, blame could be shifted to another plantation or denied altogether. This practice made it easier for abuses to disappear without consequence, especially when the victim was young. Yet this attempt at erasure ultimately failed. When fragments of the child's story surfaced in multiple places at once, inconsistencies appeared in plantation records and elite testimonies. The very absence of identity became suspicious. What had been designed to silence the child instead drew attention to what was missing. In 1856, that absence began to speak louder than any official record ever could. In slaveholding Natchez, certain truths were understood to exist, but were never meant to be spoken. Plantation society relied on a strict code of silence to protect elite reputations, especially when wrongdoing occurred behind closed doors. Crimes committed by wealthy white citizens against enslaved people were routinely concealed through intimidation, financial settlements, or quiet relocation of victims. The system functioned because enslaved people had no legal standing, and their suffering could be erased without consequence. What made this particular secret dangerous was its scope. It did not implicate a single household or isolated incident, but pointed toward a pattern of abuse involving members of Natchez's upper class. Such a revelation threatened to expose how power was routinely misused, not just by one man, but by a network of influential families who protected one another. If the secret became public, it risked unraveling the moral image the aristocracy depended on to maintain social order. The elite believed this secret was secure because of who carried it. An enslaved child was considered powerless, voiceless, and easily dismissed. Children were viewed as unreliable witnesses, and enslaved children even more so. The assumption was that fear, punishment, or forced removal would ensure permanent silence. This confidence in control led to complacency, a fatal mistake in a society already strained by internal contradictions. However, secrets rarely stay contained within a single space. Enslaved labor moved between plantations, kitchens, stables, and river docks, carrying stories along with it. What began as a guarded truth, shared in whispers, slowly spread through enslaved networks and into the margins of white society. Once fragments of the story reached multiple ears, denial became harder to sustain. By 1856, the secret had surfaced enough to alarm Natchez's elite. Sudden legal maneuvers, altered records, and aggressive silencing efforts signaled panic. The real threat was not just exposure, but precedent. If one buried truth could emerge, others might follow. For a ruling class built on silence, even the possibility of truth was catastrophic. In antebellum Natchez, wealth functioned as both protection and permission. Powerful plantation owners were rarely questioned. Even when rumors of abuse circulated, their money funded local institutions, paid legal fees, and ensured loyalty from officials who depended on elite patronage. When accusations arose, they were handled privately, framed as misunderstandings, or dismissed outright. Justice was not blind in Natchez, it was deeply indebted. Abuse against enslaved people was structurally enabled by law. Enslaved individuals were legally defined as property, not persons, which meant acts of violence or exploitation were often treated as issues of ownership rather than crime. If harm was acknowledged at all, it was considered a matter of financial loss to the owner, not a moral or legal violation against the victim. This legal framework allowed extreme abuse to occur with little fear of prosecution, especially when the accused belonged to the elite. Influence extended beyond courts into everyday silence. Overseers, household staff, and neighboring plantation owners understood the unspoken rule, do not interfere. Speaking out risked economic retaliation, social exile, or worse. Even non-elite white citizens often looked away, knowing that challenging a powerful family could destroy livelihoods. This collective complicity created an environment where abuse could continue unchecked, hidden behind respectability and tradition. When victims were children, concealment became even easier. Enslaved children had no recognized autonomy and were frequently moved between plantations under the guise of labor needs or discipline. Such transfers erased continuity and prevented outside observation. If injuries, trauma, or behavioral changes were noticed, they were attributed to discipline rather than abuse. The child's suffering was normalized and rendered invisible. This system of concealment only functioned because wealth and influence reinforced one another. Money silenced witnesses, influence shaped narratives, and fear ensured compliance. But when fragments of truth escaped this controlled environment, they revealed how deeply corruption was embedded in Natchez society. The abuse was not an exception, it was a consequence of power left entirely unchecked. Within the enslaved quarters of Natchez plantations, information moved quietly but efficiently. Enslaved people lived under constant surveillance, yet they developed discreet ways to share news through nighttime conversations, work songs, prayer meetings, and coded language. Kitchens, fields, and river landings became informal networks where stories were exchanged without drawing attention. These spaces allowed whispers to travel from one plantation to another, often faster than slaveholders realized. The child's story did not spread as a single clear narrative, but as fragments. One person heard of mistreatment, another noticed a sudden disappearance, while someone else recognized inconsistencies in an owner's behavior. When these fragments connected, they formed a disturbing picture. Enslaved people were keen observers of power and punishment, and they understood when something was being deliberately hidden. What made this case different was how many people noticed something was wrong. Family separation unintentionally strengthened these networks. Enslaved individuals were often hired out, sold, or sent on errands between estates, carrying stories with them. A cook might hear one detail in a plantation house, while a field hand learned another from a neighboring estate. By the time the story reached distant quarters, it had evolved into a shared understanding that a serious injustice had occurred, even if the full truth remained dangerous to speak aloud. Fear shaped how these whispers were shared. Names were avoided, locations were implied rather than stated, and conversations stopped abruptly if overseers approached. Elders cautioned younger people about the risks of repeating what they heard. Still, silence was not absolute. The act of whispering itself was a form of resistance, a refusal to let the truth vanish completely. Remembering became an act of survival. These whispered accounts alarmed plantation owners when they sensed a shift in behavior. Increased tension, guarded looks, and sudden discipline suggested that enslaved people knew more than they were supposed to. Once rumors escaped the quarters and brushed against white society, even indirectly, the elite recognized a threat. In a system built on control and silence, whispers were enough to make power feel unstable. As whispers spread beyond plantation quarters, Natchez's elite families began to sense that something was slipping out of their control. What alarmed them most was not just the content of the rumors, but their reach. Stories were no longer confined to a single estate. They were appearing in fragments across multiple plantations, carried by enslaved laborers, household staff, and hired outworkers. For families whose power depended on absolute control of information, this diffusion signaled danger. Elite panic revealed itself through sudden and coordinated behavior. Some families abruptly relocated enslaved individuals connected to the story, sending them to distant plantations or selling them downriver. Others tightened household discipline, restricted movement, and limited interactions between enslaved workers and outsiders. These actions were not random. They were defensive measures meant to isolate the source of the rumors and prevent further spread, even if it meant disrupting normal plantation operations. Legal confirmation of fear came in quiet consultations with attorneys and judges. Rather than addressing wrongdoing, elite families sought advice on liability, property claims, and reputational protection. Discussions focused on how to suppress testimony, manipulate records, or frame any emerging accusations as malicious fabrications. The concern was not justice, but containment. Any public acknowledgement, even denial, risked drawing attention to what they desperately wanted buried. Social panic followed legal fear. Invitations were withdrawn, conversations ended abruptly, and alliances between families grew tense. In a society built on mutual protection, suspicion itself became corrosive. Families worried not only about exposure, but about who might defect to save themselves. The scandal threatened to fracture the unspoken agreement that had long shielded elite misconduct. This panic underscored a critical truth. Natchez's aristocracy was powerful, but not invulnerable. Their fear revealed how fragile their authority truly was when confronted with shared knowledge. Once silence began to crack, even the wealthiest families understood that no amount of money or influence could fully control what people already knew. In 1856 Natchez, the legal system was deeply intertwined with plantation power. Judges, prosecutors, and attorneys often came from the same elite families or depended on them for social and financial support. This meant that when a potential scandal threatened influential slaveholders, the law was not used to uncover truth, but to manage risk. Legal strategy focused on prevention, not prosecution, ensuring that damaging information never reached a formal courtroom. One of the most common tactics was procedural obstruction. Cases involving enslaved people could be delayed indefinitely through technical challenges, jurisdictional disputes, or claims of insufficient evidence. Because enslaved individuals were barred from testifying against white citizens, the core of any accusation could be legally erased before it began. Lawyers exploited these restrictions, knowing that without admissible testimony, even the most serious allegations would collapse. Courtroom fear was not limited to the accused. Officials themselves worried about setting dangerous precedents. Allowing a case connected to an enslaved child to proceed risked encouraging future claims, destabilizing the entire social order. Judges understood that acknowledging one truth could open the door to many others. As a result, rulings were cautious, evasive, and often deliberately narrow to avoid broader implications. Record manipulation also played a critical role. Documents went missing, dates were altered, and ownership transfers were backdated to create legal distance from events. Plantation logs, bills of sale, and correspondence were selectively preserved or destroyed. These actions created confusion and plausible deniability, making it nearly impossible for outsiders to reconstruct what had actually occurred. Behind all of this was fear. Not fear of justice, but fear of exposure. Elite families knew that once a case entered the public record, it could not be fully controlled. Even rumors preserved in court filings threatened reputations built over generations. Legal manipulation became a shield, but the very need for it revealed how close the truth had come to breaking through. As the threat of exposure grew, Natchez's elite turned to direct methods of silencing anyone connected to the unfolding scandal. Enslaved individuals who were believed to know details were subjected to harsher surveillance, physical punishment, or sudden removal from their communities. Being sold, leased to distant plantations, or sent downriver was a common tactic. These forced relocations were meant to break communication networks and erase living memory of events. White witnesses faced quieter, but equally effective pressure. Overseers, small farmers, or household employees who had seen or heard too much were warned about the consequences of speaking out. Economic retaliation was a powerful weapon. A man could lose his job, credit, or access to land simply by being labeled untrustworthy. In a tightly controlled society like Natchez, social isolation could be as devastating as legal punishment. Threats were often indirect, which made them difficult to prove. Conversations ended with reminders about knowing one's place, or references to past examples of people who had spoken too freely. Churches and community leaders reinforced silence by urging discretion and warning against false accusations that could damage the social order. Morality was weaponized to protect power. Children were especially vulnerable to silencing. Enslaved children could be punished under the guise of discipline, making abuse or intimidation appear routine. Trauma, fear, and confusion were tools of control, ensuring that even if a child wanted to speak, they lacked the safety or language to do so. Silence was enforced not only through fear, but through psychological isolation. These silencing efforts revealed the limits of elite control. The more aggressively witnesses were suppressed, the more obvious it became that something was being hidden. Attempts to erase voices left traces, sudden disappearances, altered routines, and heightened tension in trying to silence the truth. Natchez's elite unintentionally confirmed that the truth existed and that it terrified them. As rumors persisted and elite families reacted defensively, the social fabric of Natchez began to strain. The city's upper class was built on tightly managed relationships, marriages, and mutual protection, and even the suggestion of scandal disrupted this balance. Invitations to social gatherings quietly stopped, conversations at public events became guarded, and long-standing alliances showed signs of tension. What had once been a unified aristocracy began to fracture under suspicion. Public behavior shifted noticeably. Church services, which served as both religious and social centers, became places of careful observation rather than open fellowship. Sermons increasingly emphasized obedience, order, and morality, reflecting anxiety rather than confidence. Ministers avoided specific references, but their messages echoed elite fears that social stability was under threat. The performance of respectability grew more rigid as trust declined. Among non-elite white residents, the fallout produced unease and resentment. Many understood that the law protected the powerful while silencing the vulnerable, but witnessing elite panic exposed cracks in that authority. Some questioned the moral legitimacy of a system that required such extreme secrecy to survive. Others chose silence, recognizing that speaking openly could invite retaliation. Doubt lingered even when words did not. For enslaved communities, the fallout was dangerous but clarifying. Increased restrictions, harsher discipline, and abrupt relocations confirmed that the rumors carried weight. Enslaved people interpreted elite behavior as evidence that the truth mattered, even if it could not yet be spoken publicly. Social tension among whites often translated into stricter control over black bodies, reinforcing the cost of instability. By 1856, Natchez was no longer operating under the illusion of absolute harmony. The scandal's social impact extended beyond any single household, reshaping interactions across class lines. Even without formal acknowledgement, the rupture was real. Once trust eroded and fear entered elite society, the old confidence could not be fully restored. In antebellum Natchez, written records were powerful tools, not neutral reflections of truth. Plantation logs, bills of sale, birth registers, and court documents defined ownership, responsibility, and legitimacy. When scandal threatened elite families, these records became liabilities. Altering or destroying them was a calculated response aimed at erasing connections between people, places, and events before they could be questioned. Plantation owners routinely controlled their own documentation. Enslaved people's births, movements, punishments, and sales were recorded at the owner's discretion, if at all. Dates could be changed, names misspelled or omitted, and transactions backdated to create distance from incidents. In cases involving children, gaps in records were especially easy to justify, since enslaved children were often undocumented from birth. These omissions created plausible deniability long before scrutiny arose. Legal records were also vulnerable. Court clerks, many of whom relied on elite patronage, could misfile documents, lose affidavits, or fail to record sensitive testimony. Depositions might be summarized selectively or excluded entirely. Once a document disappeared from official archives, it was effectively erased from history. Without written proof, accusations could be dismissed as rumor, regardless of how widely they were known. Correspondence posed another risk. Letters between plantation families sometimes contained admissions, concerns, or references to sensitive matters. When fear of exposure grew, such letters were burned or destroyed. What survives today in historical archives often reflects what elites chose to preserve, not what actually happened. Silence in the records is not accidental, it is intentional. Ironically, these alterations left behind their own evidence. Missing pages, inconsistent dates, and unexplained ownership transfers raised questions for later historians. Patterns of absence began to tell a story of concealment. In trying to control the historical record, Natchez's elite revealed how much they feared what an honest record might expose. The final and most enduring consequence of the 1856 scandal was not its immediate suppression, but the long-term burial of its truth. Natchez's elite succeeded in preventing public trials, formal indictments, or widely circulated accounts at the time. Without official rulings or preserved testimony, the incident faded from newspapers and legal memory. What remained was silence, carefully maintained through missing records and polite social amnesia. Yet history is not preserved only in archives. The truth survived in fragments, passed down through oral histories, family memories, and later secondary accounts that hinted at something unresolved. Enslaved communities remembered disappearances, sudden sales, and unexplained violence. These memories were not written in ledgers, but they endured in stories told quietly across generations, resisting total erasure. White society, meanwhile, benefited from forgetting. After the Civil War and Reconstruction, Natchez worked to recast itself as a city of elegance and heritage. Plantation homes were preserved as symbols of refinement, while the brutal realities behind them were minimized or omitted. Acknowledging scandals like this one would have disrupted the narrative of honor and tradition that post-war Southern identity depended upon. Modern historians face the consequences of this burial. Inconsistent records, altered documents, and deliberate gaps make reconstruction difficult. What can be confirmed often comes indirectly, through patterns rather than explicit statements. The absence of evidence itself becomes evidence of suppression, revealing how much effort went into controlling the historical narrative. The truth was never fully erased, only obscured. The fact that it still demands attention today proves that power can delay accountability, but not destroy it. In revisiting what Natchez tried to bury, history regains voices that were denied justice in their own time, and silence finally begins to lose its grip.